When the moose stepped out of the woods and simply stood in the yard, I thought he was lost. But my breath caught because I knew it wasn't an accident. I had been stacking firewood behind the smokehouse, trying to look busy so my granddaughter wouldn't see how jittery her arrival made me. Emma had driven up that dusty track an hour earlier, 8 months pregnant and glowing like sunrise. She wanted quiet, she said, wanted the baby to hear wind in the pines before hearing engines in the city. The evening opened like any other country dusk. One whip poor Will calling, crickets tuning, wood smoke curling from the stovepipe. Nothing hinted at trouble until Amos Traeger, my closest neighbor, rattled up on his ATV. He killed the motor, and the hush that followed felt loaded. "Sheriff stopped by," he muttered, eyes on the house. "2 convicts busted out of Brush County this morning, headed north, armed, likely desperate." His gaze slid to my old shotgun hanging over the door. "You still keep shells?" I lied and said yes. Truth was, the ammo was so old I wasn't sure it would fire. Amos spat, wished me luck, and rolled away. I watched his taillight fade and felt the forest lean closer. I'd hunted this land 40 years, back when my legs were sure and my eyes were younger. I knew every draw, every game trail, every place a man could hide. Fugitives run downhill toward water, toward farms, toward easy targets, toward us. I hid my worry from Emma. We carried her bags inside, parked her rocking chair near the window that faced the garden. She laughed at my fussing, said the baby was kicking at the smell of cornbread. For a while the normalness lulled me. Then the last light bled from the sky, and the yard turned silver under a rising moon. That's when the moose appeared. One heartbeat, the yard was empty. The next, he was there, huge, dark as iron, antlers wide enough to shadow the porch. He didn't browse, didn't sniff. He just planted those long legs and stared at the house, at me, at something beyond my reach. My heart slammed so hard I tasted copper. Moose don't loiter near people. They feed, they fade. This one was a statue with a pulse. I stepped off the porch, whispering, "Easy, big boy," but he never flinched. The whites of his eyes shone like small moons. Emma cracked the screen door. "Grandpa, what is it?" The spring squealed, and the moose swung his head. I raised a hand, motioning her back. She obeyed, but I could feel her fear buzzing through me. The animal snorted, steam pluming, then lowered his antlers a breath, as though guarding the steps. The yard smelled odd, metallic, like old pennies. It took a moment to place it, the tang of fear, the scent dogs catch before violence. I scanned the tree line, just darkness, yet every shadow looked shaped like a man. I remembered cold nights stalking poachers, how the woods would go mute before a rifle cracked. Tonight they were mute again, and the moose was the only thing breathing. I wanted to retreat, bolt the door, call the sheriff, but the cell signal dies here, and last week's storm killed the landline. We were alone. Emma, the unborn child, and this impossible guardian. The animal pawed the dirt once, twice. His ears flicked toward the lane where 2 faint ruts glimmered. I heard nothing, but he heard something coming. I backed up the steps, grabbed the shotgun. My hands shook so badly the barrel clattered on the rail. Emma whispered, "Grandpa, please." I couldn't answer. My eyes were locked on that great dark face, trying to read the message smoldering there. Minutes stretched. Wind shifted, bringing the stink of diesel, sweat, cheap tobacco, human smell. The moose stamped, louder, antlers tilting. Somewhere beyond the cedars a branch snapped. Whoever lurked out there halted, sensing the wrongness ahead. I pictured them squinting through darkness at a silhouette, antlers like spears, body like a freight car, blocking the only path to the porch. Emma's palm found my back. She breathed, "This can't be real." I almost agreed, but the boards under my boots said otherwise. Then, As sudden as his arrival, the moose took 3 slow steps forward, positioning himself between us and the trees. His breath rolled, steady clouds in the moonlight. He was waiting, guarding. I'd read stories, hikers trampled, dogs flung into the treetops. Moose are unpredictable, deadly, but this one stood like a sentinel, conscious of the line he'd drawn. The forest held its breath. No owl called, no cricket dared, only wind and the thud of my heart, and in that stretched thin silence I understood the thing that stole my voice. This was no accident. The moose was here for a reason beyond any logic I owned. I thought it was just a beast come to graze, but nature had another surprise waiting. Emma hummed in the kitchen, chopping rosemary, the scent drifting through the screen like a hymn. Outside, the moose still filled the yard, a living wall between our house and the world. All night he'd stood there. Dawn hadn't dimmed his purpose. I stared at him from the porch, waiting for the spell to break. Nothing in 40 years of ranger work had prepared me for a guard with antlers. I clanged a lid against a bucket, an old trick to chase bears. "Go on now," I called, stepping onto the grass. "Find your meadow." He flicked one ear, the only sign he'd heard, then fixed his gaze on me. It hit like a weight I couldn't shrug. His eyes were glass dark and steady, as if he were reading my thoughts. He looked at me like I was his own. I waved the lid harder, shouted, stamped. He didn't flinch. Instead, he drew one breath so deep his ribs lifted, then he exhaled with a low gust, warm as barn air. My heartbeat thudded in my wrists. For a moment, I felt absurd, a skinny old man scolding a creature that could split me with one toss of its head. I almost laughed from the tension. Then the phone rang. The landline had sputtered back to life overnight. Maybe a mercy, maybe a warning. I jogged inside, gravel crunching under my boots, grabbed the handset. Deputy Morse spoke without hello. "Morning, Mr. Adler. We've had another sighting of the escapees. Mile marker 18 on County Road 9. That's 6 miles from you. They could be headed north. 6 miles of timber and 2-track. Not far for men running on fear." I thanked him, hung up, and felt cold seep into my bones. Emma looked up from the stove. "Bad news?" I forced a smile, told her to keep the doors locked, then slipped back outside before she could read the worry on my face. The moose had moved. Not away, never away, but across the yard, legs clocking a silent circle around the garden beds. Slow, deliberate, like a sentry pacing a wall. He completed one loop, paused by the oak, tested the wind, then started another. Each circuit traced an invisible boundary. Our home inside, danger out. I'd seen wolves patrol like that, but moose? Never. I tried to reason it out. Maybe he smelled the stew, maybe he was restless from flies, yet the cadence of his steps said otherwise. Head high, ears swiveling, he was listening to threads I couldn't hear, watching angles I couldn't see. A fresh breeze carried distant engine noise, brief, throaty, gone. The moose halted, antlers tilted toward the sound. My skin prickled. He resumed his circle, this time angling closer to the porch. When he passed beneath the gutters, the boards creaked, though no hoof touched wood. The whole house felt smaller next to him. Emma peeked through the kitchen window, flour on her cheek. The moose lifted his nose to the glass, gently, almost tender, fogging a crescent on the pane before moving on. Emma's hand flew to her belly, eyes wide with wonder, not fear. I thought that might be the end of it, that he'd finish the loop, lose interest, and wander back to the tree line. But nature was winding a tighter spring, and I was too slow to see it. I set the useless shotgun by the door and stepped onto the porch again. "What are you waiting for, big friend?" I murmured. He paused mid-stride, turned, and faced me square. The air between us felt thick, electric. A jay screeched overhead. He didn't blink. He squared his feet, lowered his head, not in threat, but in declaration. The message settled heavy in my chest. "Stay inside. Let me watch." Emma called softly. "Lunch is ready. I told her I'd be right in, but my eyes stayed locked on the animal. He began a new patrol, slower, pausing at each corner of the yard, scanning, sniffing, listening. The minutes stretched, the stew cooled, and my nerves twanged tighter with each pass he made. Wind shifted again, carrying the faint scrape of tires on gravel, then silence. The moose froze, one foreleg raised, ears pricked toward the lane. I followed his stare, but saw only the shimmer of heat on dirt. Still he stared, muscles quivering like a bowstring. I realized he wasn't waiting for directions from instinct. He was anticipating movement, anticipating them. I swallowed hard, stepped backward into the house, and slid the bolt. Emma set a bowl in front of me, but I couldn't taste a thing. Through the window, I watched him pace, circle, pause, pace, each stride carving a deeper truth into my gut. We weren't alone. We were protected. For now. The yard held its breath, the forest listening, the road somewhere beyond the pines winding closer to our door. And the moose walked his silent rounds, antlers catching the noon sun like warning flags, while I sat inside and trembled at a question I dared not ask out loud. How long can a miracle stand guard? I didn't know the answer, but the open sky outside said we were about to find out. Night leaked across the fields like ink, swallowing the last scraps of daylight until the house felt adrift in black water. Inside, nothing moved except the pendulum clock and the pulse in my throat. Emma had dozed in the rocker, one hand over her belly, the other still clinging to a soup spoon. I sat across from her with every lamp off, listening, really listening, to the dark. Outside, the moose hadn't budged. He was a darker shadow against the yard, antlers cutting a strange crown against the stars. I tried closing my eyes. Couldn't. Every board creak sounded like a footstep, every gust through the shingles, a whisper. Around midnight, a soft shuffle drifted in, brush against fence wire, then a high, thin cry, a rabbit maybe, but it jerked me out of the chair. I edged to the window. The moose's ears were pricked, his whole body leaned forward, reading the night the way old trackers read snow. He knew something. I felt it in my bones. Minutes crawled. The stove ticked as it cooled. I thought I heard distant gravel crunch, then silence again. I forced myself back to the sofa, laid down with the unloaded shotgun across my chest like a crude security blanket. Sleep came in scraps, a breath here, a blink there. At 2 or 3, a heavy thud jolted me upright. Hoof or boot, I couldn't tell. Emma's scream sliced the dark. "Grandpa, someone's at the door!" I sprang up, gun in hand, worthless iron but heavy enough to swing. Emma backed into the hall as pounding rattled the back door. Hinges squealed. Wood cracked. A man's voice hissed, "Get it open!" Another voice cursed. I kicked the front door wide and leapt onto the porch. Cold air slapped me awake. Moonlight laid everything bare. 2 men in the yard, rough, dirty, breathing hard. One wore a torn gray mask, eyes pale above a filthy bandana. The other held a crowbar, grin shining through stubble. Between them and the steps, our sentinel. The moose stood broadside, antlers low, black eyes fixed on the intruders. The masked one barked, "Move, beast!" He stepped right. The moose mirrored him. Step left, same. Crowbar man laughed. "Look at this. We break out just to get stopped by Rudolph on steroids." He waved the bar, clanged it on the old pump. Sparks hopped. The moose stamped, deep chest heaving. I felt the ground tremor through the porch boards. The men noticed too. Their jokes faltered. The masked one squinted at me. "That your pet, old man? Guarding the pregnant girl?" I swallowed, voice thin. "Leave now. Take the road south. Sheriff's on his way." Crowbar man hooted. "Sheriff's 2 hours off. We need wheels and food, maybe a hostage. Step aside." I edged onto the stairs, shotgun raised, though empty. One more pace, and I can't stop him. They hesitated, just long enough for the moose to claim the moment. His ears pinned, nostrils flared, and he hurled his body forward with a grunt that rattled my ribs. The ground thundered, masked man dove sideways, crowbar man swung, metal singing off antler. The blow might as well have struck a locomotive. The moose plowed into him, tossing him like a rag over the rain barrel. Wood splintered as he landed, breath whooshing out in a howl. Masked man scrambled to his feet, eyes wild. What the? He's actually guarding her. He backed toward the gate, hands up, voice cracking. Easy, big fella, easy. But the animal wasn't listening to bargains. He pivoted, hooves churning the frost, and charged again. I saw 8 feet of antler drop like a battering ram. Masked man yelped, stumbled over a wheelbarrow, and vanished into weeds. The moose halted, head high, scanning the dark where the fugitive ran. He pawed the dirt, 1, 2, then swung toward Crowbar Man, who moaned against the barrel staves, breath broken into little sobs. In that moment the yard felt holy. Moonlight, steam rising off the moose's back, broken men littering the ground. Then silence, heavy as judgment. My knees shook so hard I had to sit on the step. The moose turned to me. His eyes weren't wild, just sure. He looked at me the way a firefighter looks at someone he's pulled from flames, checking that I was still breathing, still worth saving. Emma's voice floated from inside, trembling. "Grandpa?" I called back. "We're safe. Stay there." The moose shifted, nostrils working, then angled toward the fallen Crowbar Man. One colossal hoof tapped the dirt inches from the man's arm. Warning. The fugitive whimpered, rolled away, and limped after his partner into the trees. Branches cracked, footsteps faded, and the night breathed again. For a heartbeat, I thought it was over, that the danger was past, and dawn would bring nothing but relief. But nature hadn't finished showing how thin the line between terror and wonder could stretch. The moose remained, muscles coiled, eyes fixed on the trail where the men had vanished. He wasn't celebrating victory, he was waiting. For what? I didn't yet know. Moon slid behind clouds, yard fell into silver-gray gloom, and there he stood, a living fortress beneath the dark, while I sat clutching an empty gun, shaking with gratitude and fear in equal measure, praying the miracle wasn't done with us yet. I don't know what thunder sounds like from the inside, but when the moose drove his antlers under the masked man's ribs and flicked him across the yard, the boom felt big enough to tear the night in half. The convict's body flew higher than the clothesline, turned once in moonlight, and crashed into my woodpile with a sound like splitting ice. Logs avalanched over him. He didn't move, just lay there, ragdoll limp, groaning in a voice too small for the size of his pain. The other man, crowbar still clutched in white fingers, stumbled backward, eyes huge in the slanted headlamp of my truck. "What is that devil?" he croaked, tripping over a stump. He scraped to his knees, boots skidding. "It ain't right!" His voice went shrill, wordless, as he turned and fled for the lane. Brush clawed his clothes, gravel spat underfoot. He kept looking back, expecting the monster to charge again, expecting death to come pounding behind. But the moose only watched. He stood there, a tower of muscle and breath, tracking the fugitive's retreat with calm, black eyes. Steam poured from his nostrils like smoke from a forge. A ribbon of torn denim fluttered from one antler. A shred of the first man's jacket pinned like a conquered flag. Every instinct in me screamed run, yet I couldn't move. My knees locked, my jaw hung slack. The yard was a battlefield lit by a cold, indifferent moon, and I was the lone survivor who hadn't earned the victory. Behind me, Emma sobbed somewhere in the dark house. Each cry stabbed through the fog in my head, pried me loose. I staggered to the porch steps, half expecting the moose to turn on me next. He didn't. He stared after the escaping man until the last footfall died, until night stitched the wound closed. Then, slow, deliberate, he pivoted toward the house. My breath snagged. A whimper slipped out before I could swallow it. He advanced one pace, then another, hooves cracking frosted weeds. When the porch rail finally met his shadow, he stopped, exhaled, and dipped his head, just a fraction. As he lifted it again, moonlight caught the filament of fabric on his antler. It gleamed blue for a heartbeat, like a scrap of sky snagged on a branch, then lay still. I gripped the useless shotgun tighter, thumb seeking a safety that wasn't there. He lowered those antlers level with my face. I could smell sap and musk and something coppery I didn't want to name. But there was no rage in his eyes now, only a warning stillness, the kind old dogs give toddlers near a backyard gate. "Stay behind me. Let me handle this." "Easy, boy," I whispered, voice trembling. "It's done. You can go." But even as I said it, I felt the lie. It wasn't done. Somewhere out there, the runners still breathed, still plotted, still carried fear like a spark looking for tinder. The moose seemed to know it too. He swung his head left, scanning the dark ribbon of road. He listened longer than any man could stand still, then faced the porch again and planted himself square before the door. From inside came the scrape of a chair, then Emma's voice, thin fiber stretched to the point of breaking. "Grandpa?" I wanted to tell her the danger had passed, that the miracle guarding us was enough to make the world safe. But my throat closed around the words. I looked at the great beast standing sentinel and realized I had never felt smaller or more protected in all my years. He looked at me like I was his own. Tears blurred the yard. I let the shotgun drop to the boards and pressed both hands to my eyes. Fear shook through me. Fear of what I'd almost lost. Fear of the power standing inches away, and a deeper fear that I could never repay the debt suddenly burning in my chest. When I blinked clear, he was still there, antlers glinting, breath a steady metronome in the cold. "Thank you," I croaked, absurd words to cast on the silence. He twitched one ear as if he heard some distant echo, then settled. The wind shifted, carrying a wail from the woodpile, the first convict struggling under the logs. He wasn't dead after all. A hoarse sob bubbled up, mingled with curses. I thought the moose might finish what he'd started, but he merely angled his body, shielding the doorway, eyes never leaving me. I should have rushed to tie the man, to call the deputy again, to do something. Instead, I stood rooted, awe-wrestling dread in my chest. Just hours ago, I'd tried to chase this creature away, waving a tin lid like an idiot. Now I understood. He hadn't come to intrude on our peace. He was the peace, drawn here by some thread older than fences and laws. The convict groaned louder, pulling boards aside. Emma's sobs faded to hiccups behind the wall. The moose breathed, 1, 2, then eased a step closer to the door, as if sealing us inside a circle no malice could cross. Moonlight pooled around his hooves, and the yard hushed, waiting for the next beat of the story. I thought, for the briefest moment, that the worst was behind us. But dawn was still hours away, and miracles, like storms, rarely pass without one last thunderclap. And there he stood, ragged cloth fluttering from his antler, silent proof that the wild sometimes chooses sides, while I, shivering on the porch, tried to decide whether to fear him or fall to my knees in gratitude. The man under the woodpile gasped louder with every minute, and each rasping breath punched panic deeper into my gut. My fingers fumbled the rotary dial, spinning numbers that suddenly felt too slow for blood and fear. When the dispatcher answered, I could barely shape words. "This is Walter Adler, Lone Pine Road. The escapees, one's down, the other fled north. Send deputies, send anyone." Static crackled. Then, "Mr. Adler, stay inside. Units are 3 miles out." 3 miles of night and nerves. I thanked her, hung up, and leaned my forehead to the wall. My pulse hammered so hard the boards seemed to shake in sympathy. Behind me, Emma's voice wavered, raw from crying. Grandpa, he saved us." She stood in the hallway, clutching a quilt like armor, tears silvering her cheeks. I followed her gaze to the door where the moose still cast his enormous shadow. Logs shifted outside, another grunt from the pinned man, but the animal never flicked an ear. He might have been carved from the very trunk he guarded. I told Emma the police were close. She wiped her face, whispered, "He knew they meant harm. Animals don't do that." But he did. Her wonder braided with dread wrapped around my heart like barbed wire. Blue strobes skimmed the treetops minutes later, throwing ghostly stripes across the ceiling. Engine hum crept up the lane, headlights skewering branches. Deputies spilled out, flashlights, pistols, the sharp bark of orders. I stepped onto the porch, hands high, throat dry. "Over here, careful, there's a moose." Words died as they spotted him. Even washed in cruiser light, he seemed unreal, antlers towering, coat dark as burned earth, breath puffing slow columns that glittered like snow. One deputy raised a hand, signaling the others to keep distance. "That your, animal, sir?" "Number, he's protecting us." They fanned out, guns angled low, eyes darting between me and the fallen convict groaning under spilled logs. The moose swiveled his great head, tracking every movement but not advancing. He was stone until they edged too close to Emma's window. Then one hoof stamped, a warning thud that rattled loose snow from the eaves. The deputies froze, shoulders bunching. The sergeant murmured into his radio for wildlife control, but I knew no tranquilizer would outrun a miracle that chose its own timing. Footsteps crunching glass and bark told me the other fugitive was still somewhere in the dark. The deputies started a search line along the tree line, leaving one officer to cuff the injured man. Meanwhile, adrenaline drained from my limbs, leaving me lightheaded and empty. Gratitude surged, unformed, desperate for shape. I darted into the kitchen, tore a heel off yesterday's loaf, dense, molasses brown, Emma's favorite. Bread was all I had to offer a creature who'd risked everything for people he'd never met. I stepped down the porch, palms sweaty around the warm slice. The nearest deputy whispered, "Sir, I wouldn't..." But the words melted as the moose fixed those dark eyes on me. I inched forward, bread extended like an olive branch. "Here, boy. Thank you." Moonlight gleamed on the scrap of denim still caught on his antler, fluttering in the squad car breeze. He lowered his head, nostrils flaring near my hand. For a breath, I felt his exhale, damp, wild, full of something evergreen and older than fences. He didn't eat, he just looked. Up close, the darkness in his eyes held depth I had no right to name, something almost human, as if he knew everything. Every fear we'd swallowed, every prayer we'd whispered, every heartbeat we'd nearly lost. My throat closed. The loaf trembled. I felt 5 years old standing before a parent who sees straight through to the truth you're afraid to speak. Then he did the one thing for which I had no words. He blinked, slow, deliberate, and I swear it felt like forgiveness. A pivot so small, yet so enormous I staggered back. It wasn't rejection of the bread. It was recognition. Keep it for the ones still hungry inside. The message landed heavy, holy. I set the slice on the porch rail. He wouldn't touch it. Instead, he lifted his head, ears tilting toward the timber where flashlights bobbed. A deputy shouted, distant, "Hands where I can see 'em!" followed by scuffling, then curses swallowed by trees. The second fugitive had been found. Relief sagged my legs, but the moose kept watch, muscles taut, until the last echo faded and every man with a badge stood accounted for. Blue lights died down, radios crackled final clear codes. Still the animal lingered, silent and massive, guarding emptiness now that danger was cuffed and caged. A deputy tried to edge closer with a rope, but I lifted a palm. Let him be. He'll leave when it's time. I wasn't sure how I knew, only that some thin thread of understanding stretched between us, humming like a live wire. Minutes stretched. The night lost its sharpness. Dawn hinted pale behind the pines. The moose drew a long breath, released it, and stepped back from the door. 1, 2 strides. He paused. Last look at Emma's window, last measure of my shaking gratitude, then turned toward the forest. The torn denim fluttered once more, catching the cruiser's leftover glow like a tattered banner of victory. He melted into shadows so seamlessly it felt like waking from dream to daylight. I thought the wonder might fade with him. But somewhere deep in my ribs, a new pulse had started, the sense that fences grow small when the wild decides to stand beside you. And I knew this night would echo for the rest of my days, every heartbeat a reminder that miracles sometimes wear antlers and see straight into human eyes. Deputy Morse shone his flashlight along the churned-up dirt, the beam hopping from broken logs to the spatter of footprints that zigzagged toward the tree line. "They split here," he muttered, crouching to study the tracks. "One set heavy, dragging, your boy under the woodpile, the other lighter, sprinting downslope." He tapped the hoof-pocked earth in wonder. "And these, never seen a moose trample like that outside rut season." Blue strobes had gone dark, but spotlights from the cruisers still spilled white pools across the yard. Emma sat on the porch wrapped in quilts. A medic hovered beside her, checking pulse and pressure while murmuring reassurances. Inside my chest, adrenaline had begun to ebb, leaving my bones hollow and my voice unsteady. I told the deputies everything, how the moose appeared hours before the attack, how he blocked the door, how he slammed one convict through the air like a toy. Deputy Rains, younger, skeptical, tilted his Stetson back and barked a laugh. "A moose playing bodyguard? Sir, with respect, they're skittish. They browse, they bolt." He flicked his pen in the air as if signing the matter closed. Probably just spooked him by coincidence. "Coincidence doesn't leave bruises like that," I shot back, gesturing at the stretcher where the injured fugitive now lay, wrists cuffed, face blanched with shock and pain. Rains shrugged. "All I'm saying, wildlife follows instinct, not morals." I wanted to argue, but words collapsed under the weight of exhaustion. Instead, I motioned toward the orchard, where the moose still lingered half-lit by cruiser glow. He had stepped clear of the porch after the cuffs clicked, but he hadn't bolted. He stood motionless, shoulders rising and falling, antlers haloed with slow mist. "Tell me that's instinct," I whispered. Rains followed me closer. The animal watched our approach, unmoved, a granite monolith in the thawing night. At 10 paces the deputy stopped, bravado thinning. "Easy, big fella," his voice cracked on the last syllable. The moose's ear twitched, otherwise he might have been carved from basalt. I lifted a flashlight. The beam caught on something dark along his right antler. Rains leaned in, squinting. A ribbon of plaid flannel, ripped from the convict's jacket, hung there, knotted by a drop of drying blood that sealed cloth to bone. It fluttered when the animal breathed, a tiny flag announcing a victory no one could explain. The deputy exhaled a word I won't print. He took one slow step back, hat clutched to his chest. "Well, I'll be..." Across the yard, the medic called for help, rolling the injured man onto a gurney. The moose swiveled an ear toward the commotion, gauged it safe, then returned his gaze to me. For the second time that night, our eyes locked, and every certainty I'd ever held about the gulf between man and beast fell silent. There was something almost human in those eyes, an ancient knowing, as if he understood every choice that had brought us to this fragile dawn. I wanted to thank him again, to offer more than stale bread. A lifetime of outdoorsmanship had taught me how to gut a deer, read cloud cover, age a spruce by its rings, yet none of it prepared me to stand before a creature who'd just rewritten the rules of fear and mercy. My mouth opened, but no sound came. The moose shifted his weight, testing the ground like a soldier ready to march. One by one the deputies noticed. Cameras clicked, radios crackled. He ignored them all. Slowly, deliberately, he turned toward the gap between cedars, where moonlight painted a silver path. Muscles rippled, frosted weeds bowed beneath his stride. He did not hurry. He moved with the calm certainty of someone clocking off after finishing a job no one else could handle. At the shadow line, he paused, head high, nostrils flaring toward the house, toward Emma, toward the child she carried, toward me shaking on the lawn. A single breath billowed like smoke in the cold air. Then he slipped past the first trunk, the second, and the forest swallowed him bead by bead until only darkness remained. Deputy Raines let out a breath he'd been storing. "Guess I was wrong," he muttered, throat thick. "Guess we both were," I replied. Because in thinking a moose could be measured by biology charts and rutting schedules, I'd underestimated a force bigger than instinct, something that sees danger, weighs innocence, and decides to interfere. Statements were taken, evidence flagged, tire tracks photographed. Dawn bled pale behind the ridgeline while cruisers rumbled off, caged men in tow. Emma finally fell asleep, head on my shoulder, an IV dripping calm into her veins. When the last taillight vanished, the yard settled into hush. No sirens, no hooves, just wind whispering through birch leaves like someone turning pages none of us had read yet. I swept the broken logs back into a pile, set the torn flannel under glass, cleaned the porch of blood-brown smears. Morning birds began to chatter, unaware they'd missed a miracle. With every chore, a fragile normalcy knitted back together, but it fit looser than before, like a coat stretched by wind. I thought the chapter closed, that the moose had returned to whatever wild justice called him, and life would tiptoe back to ordinary. But 2 nights later, under a different moon, the forest opened once more, and his silhouette appeared at the gate again, bringing a revelation larger than the first. 2 dawns came and went, each one quieter than any morning I could remember. The deputies hauled away their evidence, the broken woodpile was restacked, and life tried to stitch a straight seam over torn fabric. But every creak of the porch boards made me glance toward the tree line, half hoping, half dreading what I might see. The third dusk slid down the pines, turning their tops copper, and I built a fire more out of restlessness than chill. Emma dozed in her rocker, a hand splayed over the gentle hill of her belly. Outside, the wind kept a soft rhythm in the gutters until it stopped dead. The silence that followed felt too big, like a held breath. I stepped onto the porch, and there he was again, huge and still, standing exactly where the cruiser lights had first caught him. No hoofbeats had warned me, no cracking twigs, just sudden presence, as though he'd been carved out of the twilight itself. Antlers silhouetted against the last orange flare of sky, he stared at the house, not moving, not blinking. My pulse lurched. Part of me wanted to race inside and lock every latch. The rest pulled me forward, drawn by something deeper than fear. I eased down the steps, boots whispering on frost-stiff grass. "You came back," I breathed, absurd words for a creature who owed me nothing. He waited. When I reached the midpoint of the yard, he advanced, slow, deliberate, each stride measured like he'd rehearsed it on the edge of dreams. The space between us folded until I could see breath roll from his nostrils in slow clouds. He lowered that great head, and before I could flinch, he laid the soft weight of his muzzle against my shoulder. The world narrowed to the warmth of his skin, the musk of pine and hide, the steady thunder of a heart beating inches from mine. I felt small, breakable, yet strangely upheld, like a sapling leaned upon by the oldest tree in the forest. Tears shocked my eyes. My hands hovered, unsure whether I was allowed to touch what felt holy. A floorboard creaked behind me. Emma stepped onto the porch, moonlight sliding over her cotton nightgown. The swell of her belly pressed the fabric tight, and right then the baby kicked, sharp enough to make her gasp and clutch her middle. The moose's ears twitched. He lifted his head and turned, gaze honing on that rounded curve with a focus that rooted me to the spot. He took one tentative step toward her, hoof as quiet as snowfall. Emma's breath caught, but she didn't retreat. Moonlight framed them, her fragile human shape, his massive wilderness form, like two halves of a legend no bard had yet set to song. The baby kicked again. She winced, then laughed through tears. The moose tilted his head, eyes deep as thaw-dark ponds, studying the pulse beneath the cotton as if he could see life itself beating there. I found my voice, low and reverent. He knows, Emma. He knows he saved more than just us. He saved another life, too. My words trembled into the night, half statement, half prayer of gratitude. Emma pressed a palm to the antler tip nearest her, breath shaky. "Thank you," she whispered, voice cracked with wonder. The moose held still, accepting the moment like an ancient king receiving tribute. Not proud, simply certain of the order of things. For a heartbeat, the yard felt larger than the whole county, big enough to hold every mystery I'd ever chased and never caught. Then a wind rose from the north, stirring leaves in a restless hush. The moose shifted, a subtle repositioning as though some far-off summons tugged at sinew and bone. He breathed once, long, deliberate, and stepped back from both of us. A wave of loss hit so sudden it stole my breath. I wanted to beg him to stay, to guard us until the baby cried its first morning cry. But I knew miracles live by their own clocks. He turned toward the gap in the trees, paused, and cast one final look across the porch, the fire-lit window, the rocking chair where new life would soon awaken. In his eyes, I saw the whole wilderness bow to the fragile future resting under my roof. I thought that was goodbye. He melted into darkness, antlers brushing spruce boughs, hoofbeats absorbed by moss until nothing moved but shadows. The yard stood empty, the night ordinary once more. Emma wrapped her arms around her belly, tears slipping free. I gathered her close, and for a long time we said nothing, listening to the hush he left behind. I almost convinced myself he was gone for good, that his part in our story had closed with a final silent blessing, but miracles don't follow human chapters, and deep inside I felt a new tremor, an unfinished note, warning that the wild still had one more truth to set at our door. He slipped into the trees that night the way a candle's smoke slips through an open window. Here, then simply part of the dark. One heartbeat he filled the yard with muscle and breath, the next he was nothing but the hush of needles settling after a wind. I stood there long after the shadows closed, hoping the night would reverse itself and pour him back across the clearing. It never did. Weeks passed, and life barreled forward the way life insists. Emma went into labor on a storm-slick morning that rattled the roof like a fist. She squeezed my fingers until they were numb, and when the midwife finally laid that red-faced miracle in her arms, thunder cracked so hard the lamp swayed. The boy's first cry cut through the storm like a hunting horn. Emma looked at me, cheeks wet, and whispered, "Levon, our little lion." I nodded, because no other name felt remotely strong enough to honor a creature that had fought to make this moment possible. Levon grew fast. Too fast, if you ask a grandfather trying to memorize every expression. At 6 months, he laughed whenever wind rattled the window panes, as if he recognized some wild voice calling. At 1 year, he toddled to the porch rail and stretched stubby arms toward the tree line, squealing like he expected someone colossal to step out and scoop him up. Every time he did it, a shiver ran my spine. Spring came around, the first one since the siege, and with it, that ache of unfinished business. Before dawn on the equinox, I pulled on my old ranger jacket and walked to the edge of the meadow, cold dew soaking my cuffs. I cupped my hands and called the way moose callers do in rut season, low, resonant, half hoot, half prayer. The sound fell flat against the pines, answered only by a jay's sharp laugh. I waited until sun cleared the ridge, called again, then headed home feeling foolish and alone. Yet halfway back my boot struck a fresh track, deep, cloven, almost hidden beneath new grass. The edges were crisp, the imprint still held water from last night's rain, one print only, like a single word whispered and swallowed. I knelt, ran a trembling finger along the rim, and heard my pulse drumming in my ears. He had been here, hours ago, maybe minutes. Watching? Guarding? I couldn't know. But Levon woke that morning giggling at nothing, and I chose to believe the two moments were braided together. That became the pattern. Each spring I returned to the meadow and called. No antlers parted the shadows, no thunder of hooves, but a sign always waited, a single print behind the woodpile, a tuft of dark hair snagged on barbed wire, saplings bowed in a path wide as his chest. Not enough for proof, just enough for faith. And every year Levon grew stronger, steadier, carrying something in his eyes that reminded me of moonlit breath and a rag of flannel fluttering from a crown of bone. The third spring nearly broke me. No track, no hair, only silence so complete it rang. I walked the perimeter twice, knees aching, heart caving in. At the porch, I slumped onto the top step and let the loss wash over, heavier than I'd ever let it be. Levon, now toddling fast enough to scare every chicken in the county, climbed into my lap and pressed a sticky fist to my cheek. "Grandpa sad?" he asked, words still new on his tongue. I managed to smile, told him I just missed an old friend. He studied me with those solemn eyes, lakes that remember the moon, Emma liked to say, and patted my face again. For a moment I could almost see a great shadow behind him, antlers haloing the doorway, patient as dawn. That night, when wind rattled the gutters and rain tapped the tin roof, I woke to a soft thud outside the nursery. I slipped from bed, heart hammering. Moonlight spilled down the hall, silvering the floorboards, and there, just outside Levon's window, lay another perfect hoofprint, rain-bright, already filling with moonlit water. No noise, no movement, only that single silent vow impressed into mud. I pressed my palm beside it. The print swallowed half my hand. A sob escaped before I could swallow it back. If your heart is pounding right now, you understand. Subscribe. This place is where we tell the truth. Years will roll on, fences will sag, and perhaps someday Levon will outgrow stories of a midnight guardian. But every equinox I'll still walk to that meadow and call, voice ragged but steady, just in case the forest chooses to answer in flesh instead of footprints. And if it never does, if the last sign fades and only memory keeps vigil, I'll still believe he's out there, eyes watchful, spirit woven into every pine shadow that leans toward our house when the wind turns cold. Because once you've seen the wild decide to stand between innocence and terror, you can never again pretend nature is indifferent. You carry the mark forever, like blood on an antler, like a child named after courage, like a single track that reminds a trembling heart it was never alone. I waited until the wood stove settled into its midnight hush before I opened the old cedar chest and took out the scrap of plaid flannel, still stiff with dried blood after all these years. The cabin smelled of pine pitch and sage smoke, the way it always does when winter creeps close, and I could hear Levon moving in the loft above, heavy footfalls of a grown man too polite to interrupt an old man's rituals. He'd driven up from the city for Thanksgiving, his shoulders as broad as barn doors, his voice deep as river stone, and yet I still caught flashes of the wide-eyed boy who used to toddle after fireflies under this same roof. He came down the ladder carrying 2 steaming mugs. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, setting one beside me. "Storm's brewing." I nodded toward the window where the night glass had turned to black ice. "Storm always stirs the past." Levon pulled up a chair, elbows on knees, and waited. He knew I'd been brooding over something. The chest was open, the fragment of jacket spread across my lap like a battlefield flag. When he spotted it, recognition flickered. Some story half remembered, half doubted. He shook his head, almost amused. "You've kept that rag all this time?" I brushed a thumb over the frayed edge. "Some things you don't throw away." He exhaled, folding those big hands. "Grandpa, I was 5 when you last tried to explain it. I thought it was the greatest fairy tale on earth, but I'm not 5 anymore." That pricked me, but gently. I set the flannel on the table, took a sip of coffee gone lukewarm. "You think it's a fairy tale? Come on, a moose playing knight in armor, guarding a farmhouse, choosing to, what, sense evil?" He lifted his shoulders. "It's a great story, but nature doesn't work like that. Animals react, they don't decide." I let the weight of the mug warm my hands. Outside, wind rattled the gutters, an old familiar clatter that once froze my blood. That's what I thought too, before that night. Levon leaned back, the chair groaning under his frame. "Tell me again then, from the top. Convince the adult me." I watched embers pulse in the stove, the same color as the moonlit breath I'd once seen plume from a living fortress of antlers. I spoke slow. The words rose like mist off a river at dawn. I told him how the sheriff's bulletin crackled over the radio, warned us of 2 escaped convicts, how his mother, swollen with 8-month life, hummed in the kitchen while dusk peeled the last safety from the sky, how the moose appeared, no hoofbeats, no crash, just there, in the yard, bigger than any nightmare, calmer than any saint, how he wouldn't leave, wouldn't flinch, wouldn't let those men cross a single board of that porch, how one swing of antlers lifted a man like a sack of corn and tossed him into the woodpile, how the second man fled, shrieking into the dark, how the whole world held its breath while a beast decided mercy was worth the bruises. I told him how deputies laughed until they saw the blood on the antler, the scrap of jacket fluttering like a war ribbon, how the moose waited for sirens to fade before melting into the cedars, how he came back 2 nights later, laid his head on my shoulder, then turned that fathomless gaze on the belly that carried the boy now sitting across from me. How I knew, you hear me, knew, that he understood the life inside was part of what he'd chosen to protect. Levon's eyes stayed on the stove, but his knuckles whitened around the mug. When I finished, silence pooled so deep we could hear the snow beginning to tick against the window. He cleared his throat. "That's vivid, but memory does strange things, Grandpa. Trauma, adrenaline, they scramble the brain. Maybe the moose was just confused by lights, by shouting." I raised a hand, palm outward, not angry, just tired of life's long explanations. "It doesn't make sense, I know that. Every rule of biology says flight, not fight. Every chart says rut season, not winter. But charts don't bleed, and I saw blood on his antler." I tapped the cloth. "From a man who tried to kill your mother, from a miracle that chose otherwise." Levon rubbed his jaw, still unconvinced, but softer around the edges. "So why keep this?" He touched the flannel. "Because some nights," I looked out the window where wind twisted the pines, "faith feels like gripping a thread in a gale. You hold on to whatever reminds you the world once tore its own rules in half just to save you." He followed my gaze to the dark glass. His reflection hovered there, full-grown, skeptical, yet haunted by child memories of hoofprints appearing after spring rain. Wind moaned through the eaves. A log popped. The clock ticked a heartbeat louder. He spoke low, and you never saw him again. "Not in flesh," I swallowed. "Only tracks, broken saplings. Once, a single hair caught on fence wire like a strand of midnight. Enough to say, I was here. Enough to let me sleep." Levon set his mug down, leaned forward, elbows on thighs. "Grandpa, It's an incredible story, but animals aren't saviors. I smiled, a thin curve. Doesn't matter what they are, matters what they did. I turned to the window, the storm's first flakes swirling like ash beyond the pane. It couldn't have happened, but I saw it. The moose protected us, not because he had to, because he chose to. The words hung there, larger than the room. We both breathed them in. A silence followed, thick, reverent, almost afraid to move. The kind of pause you hear in churches just before a hymn breaks open. Snow hissed against the glass. The stove hummed. I set the flannel back into the chest and closed the lid with a quiet thud. I learned something that night, I said, not looking at him now, but at our reflections braided in the window. Old man, grown grandson, and behind us maybe, shadows of antlers we could almost believe. Animals know who needs saving. And sometimes, only sometimes, they do the impossible, because we are not alone in this world. Levon's breath caught, just a hitch, almost nothing, but I heard it. He stared into the window, as if expecting the dark to shape itself into a massive, watchful silhouette. It didn't. Only snowflakes drifted, soft and relentless. Finally, he whispered, "I want to believe that." I laid a hand over his. Belief isn't a door you force open. It's a trail you follow. Someday you might find a hoofprint where no hoof should be. Remember this story when you do. The storm deepened, wrapping the cabin in hush. Somewhere in the timber, a branch cracked under the weight of snow, sharp, clean, like the universe signing its name. If you also believe in a special connection with animals, write. We are not alone in this world.